the PowerPoint, remember the email. If you need a copy, just let me know. Also, I think I will post it with the midterm exams just in case. But so that will be posted. You can get to work on it right away if you want, or you can wait until it's due, which is 1 week afterwards on October 9th at 5:30 in the afternoon. So that's what's going to happen. So Thursday is Dostoevsky. Next week, remember, I know I've said this before, but I just want to emphasize it. There is no class on Tuesday or Thursday. That is time set aside to work on your midterm exam. So let's see what to tell you. Oh, yes, Dostoevsky, very important work. Let me tell you a little bit about it before you get into it, because you may have some questions as you're reading it. It's an enormously important work, an enormously moving work. It is a great work of literature, but it is part of a larger book called The Brothers Karamazov. And so it is a small section. So what the Brothers Karamazov, it's hard to summarize, but it's about brothers named Karamazov. And so in the Grand Inquisitor section, they're having a conversation. So that's what's going on. That's why you'll have people breaking in, as you'll have a brother breaking in and interrupting. But it's a story one brother is telling to another, and the other brother is interrupting it also. That's the setting for the Grand Inquisitor, the story of the Grand Inquisitor. Anyway, I really hope you'll like it. It's a tremendous book. But today we're going to talk about Herman Melville and H.G. Wells. They were not contemporaries. They overlapped a little bit. But Melville's very much a figure of the 19th century. He's right in there with Mark Twain and Henry David Thoreau and all of that. He was a prominent figure. He was a friend of Nathaniel Hawthorne, of course, and so everybody seems to have been back in those days. And then H.G. Wells comes along. He really has his heyday in the early 20th century. So anywhere from World War I up until World War II is when he is best known. Very different men in very many different ways. Herman Melville came from a family that was actually fairly well off, at least at first. It was one of those sad stories, I think we've come across others already this semester, where you have a father who is bright and brilliant and ambitious, but not very good with money. And so this happened to the Melvilles. The father didn't waste it all. They didn't end up living, in a tenement flat or anything, but their standard of living went progressively down during Herman's life. And that was a little bit rough. Some real struggles, of course. The mother, as usual, held it all together. They were, traditional family. The mother was very much a strict Protestant, Presbyterian sort of person, and the father less so. So he's raised in a more or less a Christian home. I think you could, certainly a Christian home. I think you could say his own faith was a little bit more ambiguous, but he was certainly well grounded in the Bible, and that's something that's comes out in the works that you read, the work you read for today, and in any Herman Melville you read. This guy knows the Bible backwards and forwards. He's a great student of the Bible and of Shakespeare and of just about everything else, because he had a classical education. Basically, he attended the Great Books program at Pepperdine. So he starts off, he goes to school, he learns Greek, he learns Latin, he reads Homer, he reads Shakespeare, reads Rousseau, you name it, he read it all. And he throws it into or introduces it into his work, almost with the assumption that everybody has read all of these works, but he'll have allusions and references that you can only really pick up if you've read these books. Certainly the Bible, certainly Shakespeare is all over his work, but Dante and everybody else, Augustine, City of God, you name it. So he has a good, solid classical education. He was able to go to school, even though his family was struggling a little bit with money. But still, it wasn't maybe the finest schools, but he was a really good student. he became a teacher. So many people do in this course, but like so many others, he didn't really like it. And it wasn't that he didn't like teaching young people and teaching children. It's the requirements, the strictness of it all really got to him, just like it did Henry David Thoreau. He was expected to, hit people, hit kids if they didn't learn and all of that. He just didn't want to do it. He didn't think of that as education. He himself, he loved education. He loved learning, and he didn't want to have to beat it into people. So that didn't last very long. But it was, it certainly, I think, formed his opinions. It's a really interesting picture now that I look at it. That's not Melville up there. It looks like a whole bunch of little grown-ups standing around. Recitation. That's another reason Melville didn't like it so much. It wasn't about ideas. It wasn't a great books discussion table. It was about memorize, especially Latin. Amo, ama, samant, mama, samanta, samant. You had to memorize all of these things and recite them, and et cetera, et cetera. It just wasn't his cup of tea, at least in teaching. So what he did when he became a teenager in his teenage years, later teenage years, young 20s, he went to sea. And this was a thing that you did in those days if you were a young man who sought out adventure. Actually, a few young women did too. It's interesting, you can read about how they disguised themselves as men in order to do it. It must have been kind of difficulty in the close confines of a ship, but they did. But young men, what they would do, and they really came from all classes, just like Melville did. Melville went to sea partly for adventure, partly because he didn't have anything else he could do. Teaching didn't work out. He couldn't live on his daddy's money, so he went to sea as a whaler. Now, whaling at this time was huge because whale oil was huge. It was the commodity. It was like the petroleum of the time. Whale oil was used in lots of different things, but mostly it was used in lighting lamps. As you went around cities, you would always see the lamps. Very often those were whale oil lamps. And people used it in the home. It was a very valuable commodity. And so these guys would go on gigantically long voyages. Most of them were based up in New England, in Nantucket, and New Bedford, and Boston, in that area. And they would sail to the South Pacific. They would sail to the Indian Ocean. They would sail to the borders of Antarctica. They would sail all over the place in search of whale oil. These trips could last several years. And what they would do when they caught a whale, it was a gruesome but kind of interesting procedure. They basically ran it down. They would launch their lifeboats because they would be a whole lot faster. You had a bunch of men in there rowing after the whale. And when you caught up with one, because whales, of course, are mammals, they have to come up to breathe. The harpooner, who was the guy on a whaleboat, would throw his harpoon as hard as he could into the right place and wound the whale, capture, stick it into the whale, and then they'd probably throw a few more harpoons at it too, and they would ride they called it the Nantucket sleigh ride, where the whale would go and pull. It's an exhausted, wounded animal. It would pull the boat along. Hopefully, for the sailors in the boat, the whale wouldn't go deep, because if it did, they'd have to cut the line. They'd be in real trouble. But they wore the whale out, and then eventually, when the whale was worn out and died, they would haul it up onto the main ship and butcher it, render it in a process which you don't even want to think about it. It was they had to boil down the fat and the blubber and all of it to render whale oil. And it took a few days for whale, but it was worth it. They stirred these barrels of whale oil down, and they were like, not quite worth their weight in gold, but they were really valuable things to have. And so when they collected enough of these, and it might take a year, it might take more, they would sail back home. And this is what Melville did. He did it more than once. In the middle of one voyage, he actually skipped out and broke his contract. and ended up in the South Seas. He and another guy, they just thought, we're kind of done with this whaling thing, and they're in the middle of the South Seas. It's beautiful. So they hop off and they spend some time on an island, get to know the natives there, really like it a whole lot. And Melville writes his first book, which is Typee. And it's not, he looked back on it and he said, yeah, it's okay. It's a little bit adolescent, but it was the beginnings for him. It was the way he began to become known. He never got famous. He was not totally unknown. He just sort of stayed there in the middle, which is a frustrating place to be for somebody who's ambitious. He publishes the book. It gets pretty decent reviews. It sells some. It encourages him, like, maybe I can make this work full time. But, it never does. He always has to take other jobs. But it was a good beginning for him. And it really introduced people to a culture that was very, very foreign to them. And then comes Moby Dick, which he writes over a period of a few years, 2 or 3 years, I think it was. It is a book that has become immensely popular. There are movies made out of it. There are children's books made out of it, although I don't know quite how they do that because it's pretty gruesome. But it is a story which is one of the classics of American literature. It has been influential all around the world. You read part of it, you read the beginnings of it for today. It's a lot longer than that. It goes on, it tells the story of Ishmael, who you met, and we'll talk about the plot in a minute, but it did well, but again, it wasn't an immediate hit at all for Melville. It encouraged him enough to keep writing, but not enough to make a lot of money. He was married at this point, and he had a family to feed and such. But it's seen afterwards, certainly after his death. Like so many people, after his death, it's recognized. It's recognized as a great story, a great study in characters, a source of metaphors for people who are grasping for them, in my life, I'm in search of fill in the blank. My white whale is, whatever it might be. And so it's a very popular sort of story. Modernist literature writers and playwrights have taken it and adapted it in all sorts of interesting ways. But at the heart, it's a struggle between an animal, Moby Dick, who is very smart, and very mean because he has been hunted again and again and wounded again and again, and he doesn't like people anymore. Whales are mostly gentle, but if you throw enough harpoons at them, they can get quite vindictive. And this is what's happened to Moby Dick. Captain Ahab has had his leg bitten off by Moby Dick. Moby Dick's a sperm whale. They don't really eat people, but they can get mad sometimes. So he's on a quest. He is absolutely obsessed about finding and killing this whale, Moby Dick, no matter the cost. And so he's a fantastic character, and it's great to see him portrayed in a film by a really good actor like Gregory Peck did a classic version of him. And because he's monomaniacal, he's just focused totally on this quest of his. Then you have Ishmael, who is the character that you read about. And he's the everyman. He's young Melville, if you will, signing up, wanting to see the world. We'll look at the beginning paragraph that you read in just a minute. But he's a wonderful character. He's the sort of the narrator story around which it all spins. And you have Queequeg, who you also met, who is a cannibal from the South Seas, who is a harpoonman. The harpoonmen, as I said, were the people on the boat. I mean, aside from the captain, they made the most money, they got the most respect. They were like the quarterbacks, the star quarterbacks of the whaling ship, because the whole enterprise depended on the accuracy of harpooners. So if you had somebody who was strong enough and accurate enough, you stood a much better chance of catching that whale. And you didn't get paid by the hour or the day or the month. You got paid by the number of whales you caught. And so they wanted to catch as many as they could. Queequeg was a fantastic harpooner. Starbuck, if you ever wondered where the coffee shop name comes from, right there, he's the first mate. Very religious, very cautious, man of reason on the ship, and then you have others too. So it's a great collection of different characters that make up this book. But it's really the story that drives it. And the story on the surface is, fairly simple. I pulled this off the internet because I thought it kind of summed it up in a nice, simple way. Ishmael meets Queequeg. They sign up, and they sign up on Ahab's boat. They go out to sea, and talks a lot about sea life. If you read the whole book, there's whole chapters in there, whole sections, page after page after page, about the anatomy and physiology of whales. And people, they stop at that point very often. But press through at that point, and you'll come out the other side, and it will be okay. The crew encounters a lot of bad luck. Moby Dick comes along, nearly kills everybody on the boat. Eventually, he does, down the ship, and everybody dies, including Queequeg, and the sole survivor. I alone escaped to tell thee. That's Ishmael, who floats away on Queequeg's coffin until he finally is rescued, and then tells the story. So it's a great plot structure if you're into plot structures, movie writing, screenplays, that sort of thing. Now this is the beginning paragraph, which, we've read some really good beginning paragraphs this year, like Charles Dickens' Marley Was Dead to begin with, and things like that. Really great stuff. This one is good. Call me Ishmael. Remember who Ishmael is, Bible students? He's the son of Abraham, the second son. The son of Abraham, who is not the son. But so maybe that has something to do with his, bad luck. I don't know. Some years ago, never mind how long precisely, having little or no money in my purse, and nothing particular to interest me on shore, I thought I would sail about a little and see the watery part of the world. This could be Melville himself speaking, because those were his motivations as well. It's a way I have of driving off the spleen and regulating the circulation. Whenever I find myself growing grim about the mouth, whenever it is a damp, drizzly November in my soul, what great words. Whenever I find myself involuntarily pausing before coffin warehouses and bringing up the rear of every funeral I meet, and especially when my hypos get in such an upper hand of me that it requires his blues, you might say, that it requires a strong moral principle to prevent me from deliberately stepping into the street and methodically knocking people's hats off. I love that. That is fantastic writing. And so Melville does a great job. And he says, whenever I feel like that, then I go off to sea. So it's a way of driving the blues away. But it's, it actually was. A lot of young men like Melville, they didn't have much money. They headed off to sea. You're 21 years old, you're 22, you head off to sea, and it's a great adventure. Of course, it's very dangerous as well. Ahab, this book is just full of such great lines. Ahab is such a wonderfully obsessed character. He's talking about the whale here, the white whale, Moby Dick. And he says, he tasks me, and I shall have him. I'll chase him round the moons of Nibia and round the Antares maelstrom and round perdition's flames before I give him up. That's just, it's such great writing. And again, it's so much fun to see an actor or an audio narrator give these lines, because it's just made for that. The characters are just beautiful. Ishmael with his boyish charm, and Ahab with his total obsession. Well, you would think with such a magnificent book, and it was reviewed well, people liked it. Critics liked it. They had some things here and there, like the whale chapters, that they thought were kind of unnecessary, but they said, this is good. But it's that, again, stuck in that middle part, the most frustrating part of life to be in. Sometimes it's better just to fail utterly so that you move on to something else, rather than succeed modestly. But that's where Melville was. And so eventually, when he's about 40 years old, he says, no more, I'm done. I'm not going to be a writer of great novels anymore. No more stories about the South Seas, nothing like that. I'm going to write poetry because that's what I like to do. And so he took a job as a customs inspector up in New England, and it was a good, steady job. He made money, not much, but enough to support himself and his family. And in his spare time, he wrote poetry because he'd always written poetry, and he'd always loved it. But poetry, you know, if any of you aspire, does anybody aspire to be a professional poet and make your living entirely at poetry? Your parents would probably not be happy if you do that. If you want to be a poet, tell them you want to be a songwriter. That actually sounds better because they're very closely related. Poetry does not ever make a lot of money. Even if you're Homer, it doesn't make you a lot of money. So it didn't make much for Melville, but he loved it, and you know that counts for a lot. It was well received, his poetry, but still, it wasn't until after he had died that authors like Robert Penn Warren, who wrote the introduction to this edition, the great All the King's Men, he's a great novelist about politics in the 20th century, discovered his poetry. And so, again, only after he died that he gained any fame, really. And that's also at the same time that Moby Dick was rediscovered, and his other books were. And so then he becomes famous, but then, of course, he's dead. So it doesn't do you a whole lot of good if you're looking to make money, but it must be nice, at least. He dies and is buried next to his wife, and they led a very good and happy life together. Never achieved the fame that Melville wanted so much, never achieved that economic level that his father had achieved. And I think that really aided him, that he came in less on the salary level than his father ever did. But he was a fantastic writer, even if he never realized how famous he was going to be. Now the other guy is named H.G. Wells, who was British, not American. He was an author of a great many science fiction works. He didn't write just science fiction by any means, but when we talk about science fiction, if you take a course on science fiction, read a book on science fiction, the history of science fiction, absolutely 100% guarantee it's going to mention H.G. Wells, or I will refund your Pepperdine tuition if it doesn't. So, not really. but I guarantee it will be in there because he is the guy. Sure, you're going to say, well, what about Mark Twain? Mark Twain wrote A Connecticut Yankee in King Arthur's Court. You said that was science fiction. Doesn't that count? Yes, it does. But H.G. Wells takes it to a whole different level. What Twain wrote was science fiction of a sort. It was more like fantasy science fiction. But H.G. Wells does very scientific science fiction, if you will. You know, the sort of thing that looks into the future. He was a great futurist, if you're familiar with that word, and was really good at predicting things that were going to happen. Most people are really horrible at it. There's a reason that Jesus says, "Give us today our daily bread." It's because we can't know the future. We're not supposed to. But H.G. Wells, he got some things wrong, but he was actually really good at foreseeing certain things that would happen in the future, like the World Wide Web, like nuclear weapons, things like that. He foreshadows very well. The space travel, we'll talk about his space book in just a minute. But he was really good at projecting what the future would be. He was a trained scientist. He loved science, and he loved writing. And so he was able to use that and write these really fantastic stories and actually get a lot of it right from the point of view of what's going to happen. Now this is my requisite slide on young boy teaching himself, because this happened to H.G. Wells. He was educated. That wasn't the problem. He had his father, he made enough money, and he went to school and all that. But what really got him going as a young man was when he broke his leg really badly. And was laid up for months and months and months. And all he had to do, he couldn't go to school, he couldn't go outside. all he could do was read, and that's when he fell in love with reading, with stories. He read Shakespeare, he read Cervantes, he read, you name it, he read it. And so he is largely self-taught. He went to school and did learn all that stuff, but this is where he really gets going, is when he's lying in bed, and he didn't have Netflix or YouTube channels or anything like that, so he read, and he loved it, and he learned so much, and he became passionate about reading and about writing. Well, he tries his hand at school teaching too. That seems to be the thing that a lot of these people do. It's sort of a natural thing. And school teaching is like the most noble profession ever. And these guys, they go into it with high hopes. But it wasn't their hopes. It wasn't even the students that was the difficulty. It was the system that really was. Again, it could be really harsh. In England, where H.G. Wells lived and grew up and started to teach, it was all of those things. It was also a great class division, and all of it really bothered him because he hated class divisions. He just really did. And so he didn't want to be a part of that system, and so he doesn't teach for very long, but it is a part of his story. He gets married, he has a family, but one thing about Wells, I think most people would not find admirable about him, is that he had many, many, many affairs. He believed in what they called back then free love, which sounds like sort of a quaint term, but basically it's the same as we might say open marriage. If there's a woman who catches my eye, we get along, sure, we'll sleep together. And he, said, wife, honey, you can do the same thing. And she did, though not to his extent. So he had lots of women in his life, lots of different people, lots of different, what he would see as adventures, but he was certainly not provincial. He was not strict in his morals in that sense, in any way. And in any ways, he was involved in a lot of things. He was involved in charity. He was a real founder of the diabetes movement, and assisting and trying to find cures for diabetes and things like that. So he did good things. I don't want to paint him wrong, but he was not at all interested in the restrictions of traditional marriage. He was a socialist, from an economic and a political point of view. You can see his quote here. You see, I said, I'm a socialist. I don't think this world was made for a small minority to dance on the faces of everyone else. This was, we mentioned socialism before. In the 19th and early 20th century, it was much more of a big deal than it is now. As we mentioned, before again, there's not a lot of socialists who are prominent in the United States, certainly. Bernie Sanders up in Vermont, and a few others. But it's not a big movement. It was a big movement in the United States and in England during the early 20th century. It was a legitimate party that made up a substantial minority of the people. So it believes socialism, of course, is just basically the sharing of resources and taking what from giving to people who need from people who have. And in theory, of course, it always sounds very good, which is why it attracted so many people. In practice, well, that's a whole nother debate. But H.G. Wells was definitely a socialist. It comes out, if you look at it, and it's interesting to read his works from this point of view. Somebody who didn't believe in social classes, hated the social classes of England, and believed in sharing, and simply, he was disgusted by the poverty and the death that he saw around him, that poor people suffering. You may have guessed at this point he was not a traditional Christian by any means. He was not even an untraditional Christian by any means. He was an outright atheist. He didn't advertise it a whole lot because, of course, that's really bad for business. And so most atheists, even now, you won't find them, very often, saying, their beliefs, because it's not acceptable, and it can hurt. If they're actors or writers or whatever, it can hurt them. There are exceptions to that, absolutely. But H.G. Wells was certainly an atheist. What good is religion if it collapses under calamity? Here we go. It's the great question of theodicy that we've seen since Hume 111. Think of what earthquakes and floods, wars and volcanoes have done before to men. Did you think God had exempted Wybridge? He is not an insurance agent. This was after a disaster at a town called Wybridge. It's an old and a really good question to ask. If God is all-powerful, if God is all-knowing, how can so many horrible things happen in the world? Just look around, just open up a web page, and you can find them going on. People look at that, and I think it's quite a legitimate question to ask. There are legitimate answers to ask. People have been struggling with this for a long time. Christian writers, since Augustine and Boethius, have been talking about this, and I think they provide some very good answers to it. But H.G. Wells knew them, because he was very well read, but he wasn't convinced. And so this is just one example of the atheism that he has. And again, I think that comes out in his stories as you read them. It's not prominent by any means, but it's there. Well, let's look at a few of his books. The Time Machine. This is what you read a little bit of for today. It's a marvelous story, as you read, of somebody whose name is not given. He's called the Time Traveler. It's how he goes into the future. Now, time travel is huge nowadays in movies and books. People are always traveling through time. But if you notice, they almost always go back. It's much more interesting to deal with the problem of if you could go back in your life, what could you change? That's just a fundamental, wonderful question to ask. I mean, think about yourselves. If you could go back to middle school and change something, I bet you would. But there are not that many books, movies, etc., stories about going into the future. Some, but not a lot. And that's what H.G. Wells does. In this very first time travel book, I think. I mean, yeah, Mark Twain, okay. But this is the first time it's really been done seriously with a scientific point of view. And he goes into the future, and it's what he's going to find, what the time traveler finds that's so interesting, because Wells is smart enough not to impose his socialist views and his views that things are going to get better. He doesn't apply that into his books, because when you read the story, things don't get better. The time traveler goes 800,000 years into the future. And what he finds there is not very encouraging, or at least at first, maybe it seems a little bit. There are people-ish around. They're little creatures, and they seem, pretty happy, but they're pretty disinterested, honestly, in everything except just having fun. And there are also people who are living underground, who are called the Morlocks, who are basically technological cannibals, who are descendants of the working classes of the world, and the people above the ground are the descendants of the upper class, the nobility, and they unwittingly and undesirably provide food for those down there. Anyway, it's an interesting story, and there's a whole lot more to it than that. But it's what the time traveler finds when you go into the future. If you ever think the future is going to be wonderful, read this book, because it's not. It's not for the time traveler at all. And he goes, once he solves that little part, the last part of it's really interesting, because he goes then millions of years into the future. And he watches the sun growing and turning red as it envelops the earth, and the dissolution of the world, and there's nothing left alive except crabs and butterflies. It's just an amazing vision, if you will, of the future. And then he comes back and he tells the story to his friends. But highly recommended. It's not a very long book, and it's really a lot of fun to read. And it will definitely be on the top science fiction lists of anybody. Then you get The Island of Dr. Moreau, which isn't read as much. It's a story of a young man who washes up on an island, a deserted island, and at first things seem really pretty nice there. There's some nice people around. He meets them, and he then meets a guy named Dr. Moreau, who back in England was a very famous scientist. And the young man had heard of him, but what he didn't know is that Moreau was kicked out of England for vivisection experiments. That is, dissecting creatures while they were still alive. And he got into some trouble with that. You remember Mary Shelley was very concerned about that. Well, this is what Dr. Moreau does. And so he goes off to an island all by himself, or separated from people. He has people to help him, assistants and such. And he imports animals into it, like panthers and polar bears and whatever, and through surgical manipulation turns them into human-like creatures. And it's, if you think of it like that, it's interesting, but if you think of it, substitute that for genetic manipulation, and it gets to be a really interesting plot. I mean, it's an interesting story anyway, but I don't think many people are trying to surgically make animals into people at this point, at least I hope not. But there are plenty of people trying to use gene therapy to do genetic engineering, to do all sorts of interesting things. I was just reading before class, they've been able to create embryos, human embryos from skin cells. Strictly skin cells that are being introduced into the egg. You look it up and you can read about it, but there's a lot of that going on. So this story looks forward successfully in a lot of ways to that sort of biological manipulation of nature. Now you can guess, I hope, that things aren't going to turn out really well. If you've seen Jurassic Park, you know that nature always finds a way to snap back at you. And this is what happens in the island of Dr. Moreau as well. But it's a beautifully told, terrifying story. If you have kids someday, do not read them this story. They will scream. I remember I read it when I was like 13 or 14 years old for the first time, and I had nightmares for weeks afterwards. So it's a scary book. So don't let your kids read it. I'm not even sure you're ready to read it. So it's that bad. So anyway, The Invisible Man. This is another very famous story. It's been very influential because it's such a great idea. What would happen if you could become invisible? You must have thought about that sometime in your life. Not that you necessarily want to go down and steal candy bars or something, but what if you could be invisible in all of the interesting things you could do? Well, this is what the story is about. It's about a man who is a scientist, and he experiments with invisibility, and it works. He figures out how to make himself invisible. So he shows up at a boarding house one evening, and he's dressed like this, trench coat, hat, gloves. They think he's just been in a really bad accident, really bad burns. But the fact is he figured out invisibility, but he didn't figure out how to turn back. That's what he's desperately working on. So he has his potions and chemicals, and he's trying to find a way to turn back again into a visible person. And so it has all sorts of interesting twists to it. And it's a really great story. Highly recommended. Now this one, The First Men on the Moon, is amazing. Well, for a lot of reasons. It's a good story. It's a good read. But it's also amazing for all of the things that it gets right about space travel. He's writing this before World War II, but he has these gentlemen down here, English gentlemen, of course, going to the moon. They build a capsule. He deals with problems of weightlessness. He deals with problems of gravity and you name it, all the scientific things that people had to overcome. They actually launched the rocket from Florida. That's interesting. And it splashes back down in the ocean. He figures that would be a lot of the details of space programs, especially like the early space programs, they match beautifully. And this was like required reading of the early astronauts, the Mercury, the Gemini, the Apollo astronauts. They all read this book, and they even took a copy of it with them to the moon, just because it's a really good story and because he gets so much right. Of course, it makes up stuff. It's fiction. They find creatures there on the moon. They didn't expect to. they looked at it, and Wells knew very well that the moon was dry, or at least it looked inhospitable. But they get there and they find out things are a little bit different. But it's a really, really good story about space travel. And again, one of the very first books on the subject ever written. So H.G. Wells was just a superb science fiction writer. And in spite of his personal flaws and shortcomings, I think there are plenty of them. But it's hard to deny that this guy was a really good writer. Oh, yeah, The War of the Worlds. This is maybe his best-known book. You have probably either read it or you've seen a movie version of it. Tom Cruise has one of the latest ones out. There are lots of them out there. And it is, again, lays the groundwork for so many stories yet to come about alien invasions. I mean, how many movies have you seen that are about alien invasions, coming to Earth in some form or another, to hunt you or to take over the Earth or whatever. It's a hugely popular theme. And H.G. Wells is the guy who starts it. People have been writing about space travel actually since classical Rome. It's interesting stories. They didn't get it very well. Do it very well, but H.G. Wells does it very well, and you probably know the story. It's the aliens come, the people aren't really quite sure. The aliens start shooting rays at people that look an awful lot like lasers, and then in the end, hate to give the story away, but they die. They die not because people defeated them, but because of germs. They couldn't handle the common cold. And you may know that the story about this being broadcast in the 1930s and how it was done as a radio show and how people listening to it thought it was real. And you had people panicking, serious panic, up in the Northeast, and because it talked about they talk about aliens landing in New Jersey and things like that. But it's a great story, and again, it's H.G. Wells laying the groundwork for so much stuff to come. So if you like science fiction, if you want to write science fiction, if you want to write screenplays for science fiction shows and movies, this is your guy. You gotta learn to you gotta read H.G. Wells. Well, he dies. Of course, everybody does. 1946 actually is when he dies. That's a picture of him. That's sort of how I picture him. He seems sort of like a stuffy English gentleman, and from what people say, that's pretty much what he was like. But he dies in 1946. Certainly doesn't change any of his ideas. He'd suffered diabetes, and as I said, for years, and then he was instrumental, as it says here in his obituary, of launching the Diabetic Association and helping people with diabetes, which is still such a crippling problem, a crippling disease in the world. So he did some really good things in his life, and he wrote some amazing books. All right, that's it for today. I want you to go forth